Welcome one and all to another Podcasters Row. King of Podcasts.com is a website where you find all of my past interviews. And of course, this series is available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, through YouTube and YouTube Music, and Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, among other places. But my next guest, has some wonderful things he's going to bring up in terms of the area of coming from the area of journalism into investigative journalism, into creating content that works and complements great with podcasting, and also has worked where I have worked at a lot of the grassroots podcasting outlets since 2005. My guest has gotten to work with some really great mainstream large outlets that we're going to go and talk about here on the program today. So she is an accomplished audio journalist, reporter, producer, and host with over 15 years experience in the media industry, celebrated for her work on critically acclaimed nonfiction podcasts and documentary series that have captivated millions of listeners. So she is collaborating with such major media companies such as Sony Music Entertainment, Slate Magazine, has made significant contributions to popular podcasts, including Broken, Jeffrey Epstein, Viral, Do the Work, and Slow Burn. She's the creative force behind the documentary series Cover Up the Pill Plot, which was released last summer. We'll talk about that shortly. Delving into the history of the abortion pill, and which also earned a spot on the Apple Podcasts Top 200 True Crime chart. There's more to say about my guest, but we're just going to bring her on. I'm here with TJ Raphael. Thank you for being on with me. I really appreciate you taking time out and talking to me today.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So off the bat, you come from a background of journalism, and more specifically, investigative journalism. The one thing I notice now is that, in the current environment of journalism, I have a program called the Broadcasters Podcast, and on a regular basis, I talk about the plight of journalists right now and the plight of publications, whether it's digital print news or, regular print news now, television, cable, radio, all across the board, the lack of jobs available out there, and also the lack of opportunities because of the cut downs that are being made from what are very corporate entities in many cases. So the thought of investigative journalism is not something that, you would think a large news division will hold on to a lot of reporters that can really delve into the real stories and also at the same time give us the news without opinion editorial embedded into it. Talk to me about where you are right now and where your journalism background brought you into podcasting and why it did.
Yeah, so, I have wanted to be a journalist since I was in the fourth grade. I actually, in fourth grade, I had a project. I had to make a small little book called Me, Myself, and I. And the kind of last pages were what do you want to be when you grow up? And I wrote that I wanted to be a broadcast journalist and live in New York City. Since I was a kid, I wanted to tell stories. I loved reading stories. Obviously, as a child, I wasn't reading the news. But, both my parents were very interested in news and media and very political as well. And so as I grew, I had a really clear sense of what I wanted to do. And initially, I started out in a print background. And when I was a senior in college, I did a couple different fellowships. I did one with the New York Daily News. And essentially, I was working unpaid because it was a fellowship as a reporter for the news. And I was running around Manhattan, going from a red carpet event to the scene of a fire, to the scene of, a crime, a sexual assault or something, and interviewing people about what they knew. And I also was an editorial research assistant to Wayne Barrett, who was a storied investigative journalist for the Village Voice, was a reporter covering Albany, the New York State Capitol, the governor's office, the state's high court.
But the other thing, in all those areas, established, well-accredited. Again, you were embedded, first of all, from the state capitol of New York into New York City itself with some very legendary publications. Now, when you were there, again, in the learning process, was it something about which particular reporters or journalists that you wanted to have to reach out to mentor with you? Were there any particular people, without saying names if you had to, but what was it that really drew you into the area of investigative journalism? What was it that you saw that said, okay, this is the direction I really want to go?
I really had what I felt and still feel is, a moral obligation to tell stories of injustice. That has been really my North Star throughout my career. And, the reason I am a journalist and continue to tell stories, the world's a really hard place. There's plenty of people who need someone to help tell their story, to help get whatever issue that they're dealing with, get attention towards it. I could not imagine doing anything else. I feel it deep within my bones to help people tell stories and to, hopefully hold those in power accountable. As a young person in my early 20s, kind of breaking into the industry, that was the kind of journalism I really wanted to do. But then, I started to really shift into audio pretty early on. I remember when I listened to my first podcast, I was actually driving up to Albany to go back to my job up there covering the governor's office with a friend, and she was driving me and she had an iPod. Tells you around what time.
Right. Well, that's exactly when, but already by that time, podcasting had already become a term.
Yeah. And this was in 2008. She played an episode on her iPod of This American Life. And, I say it was my gateway drug. As soon as it ended, I said, do you have another one? Can we listen to more?
Now, I got to ask you this too real quickly, because it was something where there was a transition period for you because, and I understand this well because coming from radio, 1994, I went into college and radio was still kind of something relevant, but then there was a lot of deregulation. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 had passed. And a lot of companies were being bought out and swallowed up by other bigger companies. And there was just a whole fire sale of stations. And the way the radio environment was by the time I graduated in 98, it changed completely. And I imagine what happened for you in the college experience, because you did go through fellowships and internships and on, by the time you got out and you were, now professional career is off and going, the journalism landscape has changed. And so when you hear early adopters like NPR, which, by the way, on this program, I always praise because they were early in the step on this. They are also, I count them as responsible for the group to create mainstream podcasting. I think when Serial came out in 2014, they set the bar at such a great spot. And of course, adapted from This American Life, that's right there is when podcasting was on the map for everybody to notice. And that was where you got to go and hear it right at that point. And obviously, This American Life also investigative stories with like Sarah Koenig that hosted that show initially. Was that something that, did you notice yourself by listening to that program that you were going to get yourself into that environment someday?
Yeah, I mean, that was really, a moment for me where I thought, audio storytelling might be the medium that I would like to stay in. I mean, this, when I heard that podcast, it was 2008. Obviously, we're at the peak of the financial crisis. I wound up graduating a year and a half later, and print publications were shutting down left and right. So it was, a very bleak time, I think, to be a journalist, especially one focused on, solely focused on the written word. When I was at my daily news fellowship, they said, we wish we could hire you. We could bring you on full time, right. But we don't have the budget. We don't have money to hire new people because, the industry was really struggling. I mean, the newspaper industry is still struggling, so it was both, strategic, I think, in that it feels like a fresh and new medium at the time. But also I just really felt connected to hearing a story in that way. I think hearing someone's voice, and having it be part of the story, what they sound like, their emotions when they're talking, elevated that storytelling experience and made me feel like it was something I wanted to be a part of. And so, I continued, until when, it was 2013, I continued to work in print journalism. When I graduated from college in 2010, I got a job at a small trade publication in Connecticut and was writing about media business and media economics. It was not, the kind of storytelling I wanted to be doing, but I was just happy to be writing.
Staying in the profession, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. I want to ask you this too, TJ, because Also, 2007, 2008, we have, Twitter, Facebook, social media is starting to burgeon at this point as well. And I always call about this on my other podcast, the Broadcasters Podcast, about the digital disruption. Because much like newspapers, TV stations, radio stations, they were not paying attention. And how would they know? When they didn't realize the internet was going to be such a factor to hurting their business, because since that time, it's continued to go and erode away at what physical units could be sold. So newspapers, like I say, if it's the Village Voice or the Daily News, that goes by the wayside because people could find their content online. And also, looking for news that you're looking for, they might not opt to go ahead and look for it within a newspaper or a physical publication you have to open up. They're going to go find it online somewhere. So the other thing now is we're all the way from that point of time to where there's a bit of, I feel like, and this is my word, the desperation right now with news publications like the Daily News or, the New York Post or, other Washington Post, all these other papers right now, because AI is coming to play. So the full circle, this next turning right now of journalism is where journalists are no longer writing the stories. They're just doing data entry right now to feed into the machine, the computers, the algorithms that are going to write the stories for the publications. What do you see right now about this full circle turning right now? Because that's where we are at this time. And now the publications are getting paid by these AI companies more and more every day to allow the access.
Right. I mean, I think that there will always be a place for investigative journalism. I don't think it's probably going to look the way that it once was, where you have investigative journalists on staff. I think I envision happening is independent journalists will, be working on their own stuff and then pitch it out to larger publications. I mean, I actually just signed a contract with Wondery, the, podcast production company owned by Amazon. Thank you. After I, for 6 months was pursuing my own investigative story, I then, brought it to various podcast production houses. I had gotten, 4 offers for development, and I ultimately wound up choosing Wondery. And now my series is going to be released early next year. So I do think that, investigative journalism will always have a place. I do think that, the rise of AI is the, KPIs, the metrics that publishers have instituted and worked with advertisers on are, it's eyeballs, it's clicks, it's views. And so they need to be pumping out content as quickly as possible. But the thing about investigative reporting is it's not something that you can do quickly. And so, I foresee potentially, these, kind of, unfortunately for maybe like a junior staffers who write these kind of clickbaity articles, right, that those roles could go away to AI, but the revenue then generated could be used to invest in investigative reporting. But I also think it's going to be up to independent journalists who feel like they want to pursue stories and then shop them around to different outlets to get them published. And I think there's always going to be a need for that.
Right. Now, the other thing, too, is that we still see investigative journalists still out there today, but they're just not being put out there with other, they're just not out there anymore like they used to be, but they're not in the same places they can be found. But we now have Substack, we now have Medium, we have other places where Patreon that people can go and still help to support and fund those kind of investigative stories. So what do you think about, was that something that, before, obviously you're still working in the podcasting and, it's wonderful that from your background, the last 10 years plus working in podcasting that, I feel like there is about like, it's who you know still, even in podcasting today, because if you're within these larger outfits, if people know you, they know your work, you can still find your way around and still be able to go and get projects greenlit and put out there. Before I move along to that, I want to just ask you, is there anything preliminary you could tell us about this new podcast that's going to be coming to Wondery? Is there anything you could tell us beforehand? Or if not, just when we can expect, what kind of episodes we could expect and when we can see a possible launch?
Yes, the show is scheduled to launch in early 2025. I can't go too much into the specifics, but I will say the top headline is I have discovered a baby selling operation run by one of the nation's most powerful institutions. And I have, more that more than a dozen sources each record now at this point. So it's going to be a doozy.
No, absolutely.
I say I can't.
A little bit. I mean, the thing is, but you're not.
Yeah.
But you've never been prone to not go and sway away from those kind of stories. The thing is, the series you had wrapped up last summer, Cover Up the Pill Plot, dealt with the complex history of the abortion pill. So, look, and radio, I always remember two things were, if you're doing a talk show, don't talk about abortion, don't talk about religion. It's like, if you can avoid it, it's like, you do not want phone callers to go ahead and start talking about those areas, because it will be a never-ending cycle of like polarization like you never seen, or never heard, excuse me. Mm-hmm. But you went to that part, and I'm curious what you felt about when you went ahead and did that. And obviously we're going to go back to your experience with what you did leading up to it. But, the fact you got to this point of being able to do a story like this, talking about the passion and, what kind of response did you get from your peers and from the general public when this got put out?
Yeah, so I made that podcast with Sony's global podcast division. And honestly, there was some skittishness initially when I had pitched the story. I pitched it a few weeks after Roe versus Wade was overturned. I had just come off of making an audio documentary series about the shadowy business of sperm and egg donation. And I was searching for my next story. And once Roe was overturned, I knew I wanted to do something related to reproductive access in the United States. I needed to find a story that would be relevant a year later because, podcasts, especially investigative ones, take a long time to produce. And so I also knew I needed to find a story that, could sustain multiple episodes and feel like a true story that you were hearing versus let's debate a topic. And I was able to uncover a wild story that sounds like it was ripped out of an action flick or an Ocean's 11 film about a network of, anarchist punk feminists in the San Francisco Bay Area who intentionally tipped off U.S. Customs while smuggling in abortion pills that were then illegal in the United States back in 1992.
Oh, my God.
And their journey to fight the Supreme Court on that issue while also dealing in the streets with violence from the radical fringes of the anti-abortion movement. And so I found a story that felt like a thriller, honestly. And then I think it showed that, women's history, reproductive history could be as exciting as an action thriller. And so I was able to pitch it and position the show in that way and show the bigger history of what it really took to bring that medication to the United States. A lot of people kind of just know that like, oh, it was, got FDA approval in 2000. There was a decade-long battle before that, including, there was assassinations of doctors, acid attacks on clinics, bombings. It was a brutal time in the lead up to the passage of that medication. And so I was able to tell that story in a way that I think listeners found engaging and surprising. And that's, what I do hope to do in my work generally is, not just tell stories that demonstrate some of the bigger issues that our society is facing, but do it in a way that can be, entertaining and feel like, the listener has a stake and is excited to hear what happens next.
So given your background in podcasting, when you came into the space, first of all, working for The Takeaway, which, unfortunately, I feel bad that the show went by the wayside, but, WNYC for, itself, I was always a fan of all things media with Bob Garfield. And I look at what the programming has been there. And, of course, PRI, Public Radio National, always, beginning to have their programming put over on NPR, on many NPR stations. When you look at what you got to do within the NPR environment, I like to call it that, because it's something to be said about, when I do coaching for other clients in my full-time work for podcasting, I always talk about, we want to have that NPR sound. There's something about that, an intellectualism, the way it sounds, the way it's presented, something about that just resonates right. And when you got to hear that for yourself, working on The Takeaway and other programs that you worked on, talk to me about the fact of what it is about their approach. When you hear the podcast like This American Life you listened to in 2008 to today, what is it about you think that approach that just resonates so well with listeners?
I think audio storytelling, NPR, public radio really helped to perfect the art of audio storytelling. Nina Totenberg, who is, NPR's longtime Supreme Court correspondent, she has this quote that really, really resonates with me. She said, that, the power of radio and podcasting is it can let you see a drama that plays out without any pictures. And at the end of the day, it's a drama that matters. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why, public radio has been so successful. They really understood that early on, and they took the medium seriously. A lot of, publishers, traditional publishers who have started breaking into podcasting and wanting to replicate something like a serial don't understand what it takes to create an audio documentary. It requires an editorial team. It requires reporting. It requires technique and sound design and understanding how a narrative should unfold in audio versus in print. And so that's why I think public radio has been successful. And I think a lot of people who had previously worked in public radio have gone into podcasting specifically and brought through those traditions and built upon them in ways that feel really unique and satisfying.
Now, podcasting, as you've already mentioned earlier, about how it really has opened up the world for content creation, for the fact of stories like Cover Up can be told out there for more people to go ahead and hear more stories that they would probably never go and catch in other outlets. But here's the thing. These ideas that you're able to go and pitch within, these are not grassroots organizations. Again, so, to go to Sony and their global podcast division, to go and create Cover Up, or to do stories for The Takeaway, or to do, podcasts that are out there and contribute to those like Broken Jeffrey Epstein or Slow Burn. The thing is that, they're owned by corporations. And I would imagine it's kind of be tough to go ahead and pitch and give ideas that, there could be a risk, there could be a bit of a mitigation involved in terms of, will something blow back on the company by putting the story out there? Give me what you had in terms of some of the pitch meetings that you've had with some of these organizations, and have they given you that kind of thing, or have they really been very receptive and warm, and they've given you the access, they've given you basically the permission and the blessing to go as far as you need to go with the story?
Yeah, I mean, I have, largely gotten the permission and blessing. And I think the reason why is because you're not leading with topic, you're leading with the story. If you say, I want to do something on abortion rights, let's say, that's a topic, abortion rights. What is the specific story that you're going to tell? If you can find a good story, I think a lot of publishers are willing to make something regardless of the topic, as long as the story is compelling. And so I think that's a big distinction for people as they go through this journey of pitching. You can't just go to a company and say, hey, I'd really like to do something about X. Like, okay, well, what is the story that you're trying to tell? Find me, who are the characters? What are the stakes? You need those specifics before you ever walk into a pitch meeting. I'm actually teaching an online course in September with the Association of Independents in Radio called How to Pitch Your Podcast to Executives and Get It Made. So I'm going to go into it a lot there. One of my big things is like, if you're just walking into a pitch meeting with like a vague outline and being like, I would talk to this person if I got a green light, you're doing it wrong. When I pitch a show, I have already contacted the people who are going to be my main characters. I have gotten buy-in from them, access to them. I have multiple characters. I have developed an episode outline of how I imagine the story, the specific story, unfolding over several episodes. I have supplemental materials of research. I have, documents making the case for why the story should be told right now. So I think that the topic is not necessarily, murder is controversial too, just because something's on abortion, right? Like, I think it doesn't really matter as long as you have a good story. And the story I found with the pill plot of anarchist punks challenging the government and battling, violent extremists literally in the streets, that was a good story. And so I was able to get buy from that. And I think that's the key to, whether you're pitching something in print or if you're for the web or in audio, if you have a good story, you have a good story and people will want that story to be told.
So that's a good point you make, because for some people, if they want to consume that story, maybe they want to listen to it in an audiobook or be able to read it in, on a Nook or a Kindle. Is that something you've also looked at, the fact that, when you are preparing this content, do you feel like it's also something that you could generate and just re-platform onto a print platform?
Yes and no. So, I mean, I think that I probably could have told a shorter version of, something like the pill plot, for example, or even what I'm working on now. But one of the reasons I prefer audio to other mediums is because I think it allows you to go really deep and get really immersive in the story. 6 or 7 45-minute episodes is going to deliver you a lot more story than, a 1,200-word article will, or even a 5,000-word article will. For me, I could have, pitched any one of these stories in a print format, and I think I probably would have had a good shot of, getting it published. But I love audio. And so
Right.
I wanted to tell these stories in audio because, again, I wanted to hear, the pain in someone's voice when, they were telling me that, they almost had their leg broken when they were trying to defend their abortion clinic. That, when they turned on the news one day and they saw that clinic was on TV because it had been burnt to the ground, capturing that emotion in audio, it just, I think it does so much for the story versus just kind of reading that on the page.
Right. The other thing, too, is that when you look at the current environment of podcasting, it's a lot of mainstream podcasters that encompass the top of the Spotify and Apple charts. But, when I look at what they have out there now in terms of the programming that we have, okay, a lot of podcast deals are being made all across the board. Alex Cooper, Call Her Daddy, just got $100+ million per year deal over the next 3 years for her show to go over to SiriusXM. There's Smartless that went over to SiriusXM. You have Joe Rogan who eventually had that first big deal that went over to Spotify, among others. And you're seeing that those outlets are, they're trying to get into the podcasting, but they're more into the entertainment side. But when I look at Apple Podcasts in their top charts right now, the story of Noble is the most popular show now in podcasting on Apple. The story about the investigations of the American South, in winter 2002, 300 bodies on one property in the tiny town of Noble, Georgia. The whole story like that, something out of Twin Peaks. But those stories still resonate. It is hard to go ahead and find, in the world of podcasts that we have, that are all news and commentary, that are all these commentary shows, that are entertainment shows and comedy podcasts, to break through the mold and have an investigative podcast or a nonfiction podcast like this to break through the mold. Tell me about how important that is right now, because I guess, it's surprising when you find out who your listeners are and how certain stories will resonate and will become much more viral than others.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why it's so important to, have these kinds of documentaries in audio right now is, I mean, our world is really a challenging place. There are so many people out there who have compelling stories and feel like they don't have a voice or a means to tell it. And their stories are extremely important to our society, to holding people accountable. I think the podcast a couple of years ago, In the Dark, had won a Pulitzer Prize. The reporting that this podcast did actually spurred a Supreme Court case. And so, I think the best kinds of journalism can be journalism that changes the world, that holds people in power accountable, that shines a light on abuse of power. I don't care if it's done in a print medium or if it's done in an audio medium, it can be really impactful. So that's why I think it's important to have, investigative reporting in audio right now, because it's another access point. And a person might be, more willing to listen to a podcast that feels like an exciting story instead of, reading, what feels like a hard news article on, the New York Times website or the Washington Post website. So you're probably reaching a different demographic who might also not be thinking about these things until you present it to them in audio.
There's a part when it comes to the podcasts, as I just mentioned. So obviously these big podcasting outlets, SiriusXM, and then you mentioned Amazon that owns Wondery. You have, iHeartRadio, iHeartMedia also, all the podcast games, Spotify also in the podcast game, putting a lot of money now into podcast creation, more content creation than ever. Just the seemed like idea where you say to where Netflix with this model. SiriusXM's trying to go the way of Spotify, trying to create this all-in-one audio platform. But one of the things that I always look at is that, it's the way they want to make their money. Put it behind subscription models. So like, say, with Apple Podcasts, they now have the subscription model where, SiriusXM wants to put a load of their original content behind a paywall, $5.99 a month, on top of what they're paying for everybody else that they're using for SiriusXM. So again, the extra add-on buy. The other thing, too, is that, while they're putting the money in the content, would there be a risk that certain podcasts like yours or theirs are going to have, like, if you need the staffing, the resources that you have to create these bigger programs, if they're going to try to offset some of the costs by using AI and automation for voiceover work or for script writing or things like that? Are those some of the things you look at that you started to see starting to make its way, raise its head into the podcasting houses you've been in? Is that something you think might become more of a norm coming up in the future?
I don't think so, for a couple reasons. Podcast listeners like to connect with the host. I don't foresee listeners really gravitating towards an AI voice, even if that AI voice can sound like an authentic human. One of the reasons why NPR, I think a recent survey found that like their podcasts are among the most trusted to date. And that's because they trust the voices that are telling them information. So I don't think that's going to happen. I also have noticed that there's been a fairly big unionization push in the audio industry specifically, and who have been, organizing with groups like the Writers Guild of America.
Right.
And so I think that that's also going to protect against the use of AI in podcasting as well. I think that probably in the future we'll all be touched in some way by AI. I don't know what that looks like right now for podcasting. I haven't seen, AI employed, at least in the places that I have worked. There has been, a desire to work with real humans in terms of, one of the reasons why I think companies use AI is it's to cut costs, right? I think that, unfortunately, the audio industry faced some really huge layoffs last year. I was laid off from Sony in July of 2023, right after the Pill Plot launched. They eliminated their entire in-house creative department. And then I started reporting immediately and as an independent journalist and pitched my show to Wondery. I think that that's going to be the model going forward to save costs, where, independent journalists are pursuing their own stories, and then, they pitch it to a company, they get funding to help get it made. And that's a way that companies won't have to, keep people on staff, but also avoid using AI, I think, as well, because their costs are already low as it relates to, staffing costs, basically.
You made an excellent point when you talk about unionization, because, it was on the Broadcasters podcast, I actually reported about WGA East creating the iHeart Podcast Network Union. So 100 members joining that union right now and having their first collective bargaining agreement set in play. Now, when you have been in some of these other podcasting outlets, is that something that, do you feel like there's getting to a point where some of these outlets, because of who they're working with and, the conditions they're in, do you think like unionization is going to be more of something that's going to grow and continue to expand to other podcasting outlets? Do you think there's going to be someday, maybe say in a decade, where all these major podcasters are going to be unionized?
Yeah, I think unionization is going to continue to grow. I mean, I think it was just within the last week that Crooked Media, which makes, Pod Save America and other shows, they just announced that the union of, producers and the people actually making the shows there had, come to terms with the company management that they had, gotten a floor for salaries. They had gotten, really great package for paid time off, really great parental leave program. And I feel like, honestly, like every, 2 months, I'm seeing a new podcast production house unionize. So I do think that that's going to be a trend that will continue. I think that, podcasters who are working with production houses on staff, they're creative professionals. It's no surprise to me that they would want to try to work at a place that has some union protection. I think that this will continue to be a trend. When I was at Slate on staff, we were organized under the Writers Guild of America East, and I still am, even though I'm not, an employee of any company at the moment, I still am paying my dues as a WGA member. So yeah, I think that's going to be a trend that we continue to see. I think we saw, the huge protests on part of SAG, on part of WGA, part of, the Actors Guild, the Directors Guild. And so I think creative professionals everywhere are trying to collectively organize to make sure things like AI don't take their jobs eventually. So I do think that that'll continue in audio and podcasting as well.
So that sounds a good question too. So I don't know if you have participated in New York there with the writers and actors strike that did happen last year, for what, 9 months, 10 months, whatever it was. The one thing was, I guess, when you look at what the actors and writers were going for, which obviously they were justified, they had to hold out to the studios to make sure they got what they needed in terms of AI, in terms of the dues. I totally understand and justified the fact they had to go and hold this time and make sure they got as much as they could when they got to the table, and really stress the big media companies out. That I totally agree with, and I support them 100%. But now with podcasting, the same thing here, where, like you said, Crooked Media, they even walked out for a while to try to go and make sure that their dues got met when it came to minimum guaranteed salary, days paid off, benefits across the board. And I just want to know, did you get the chance to partake in any of the pickets at all? And what you see right now in terms of WGA as an entity coming in to becoming the bargaining, union for employees like yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I did participate in some of the marches last summer. I live literally half a block away from Silver Cup Studios here in Queens, which is a large, film studio. Right. And so I saw them protesting outside of there. And so I said, hey, let me walk over.
Give me a sign.
Picket sign. Yeah, I was like, oh, I didn't even know that you guys were doing this today, but I just am out for a walk. So cool. So, yeah, I mean, I did participate in that sense. And yeah, I just believe that also coming off last year where there were so many layoffs, I think that, the people that were able to survive at their companies probably got nervous and were like, oh man, we should probably unionize because, you being in a union doesn't fully insulate you, obviously, from layoffs, but it can definitely help. And so I do believe that, more and more, producers, editors, storytellers at podcast production houses are going to try to unionize. I know that there's many that already exist, and I have no doubt that that's not going to slow down.
But now the one thing of competition where radio doesn't have this anymore, unfortunately, because there's not enough grassroots radio outlets to compete or to have a presence against the larger radio companies. But the reason why radio has gone the way it is and why podcasting has taken over is because of some of the mistakes they've made. Again, the major radio companies laden with debt, they have private equity holding on to these companies and basically just picking off the bones like vultures. I really feel like it's vulture capital that has really ruined the industry there. That's why there's so many people that have come in. They're great talent at radio moving into podcasting. But the other thing too is that when you have a difference between the mainstream podcasts outlets like the Wonderies and the Crooked Medias and the Sirius XM, Spotify's, and all that are distributing all this content out. The one thing is there's all these grassroots podcasts, thousands upon thousands right now, hundreds of thousands, as a matter of fact, that are still out there competing against, all these other shows out there. So when you look at that, do you ever kind of look back and, behind your shoulder and say, we have to stay on our game because anybody can come into the woodwork and become viral sensation. And then all of a sudden, we have new people that can always compete. There's a competition within the grassroots to always keep in mind too. And also it creates the idea for, since 2008 or even before, a lot of people know now that it's much easier than ever to start a podcast. So for those that might want to get into the podcast industry, start their own, what advice would you give them and what should they look at when they look at the environment?
And my main piece of advice would be to please get a good mic. There's plenty in there's so many podcasts out there that it sounds horrible.
Agreed.
Technical standpoint. Yeah. And I mean, I think that grassroots podcasts, there are various collectives that those people can join. Like, I mentioned the Association of Independents in Radio earlier. That's a great organization to join. There are plenty of collectives that you can join to seek out support. Radiotopia I think has a really interesting business model where it's functioning more like a co-op now, where, the people that are making the podcast own a stake in the company. And so, if you are a grassroots podcaster, I mean, it's a great, get into the medium, hone your skills, perfect your skills, and, tell those stories. And you can then, pitch it to a big company. I think that we actually are in a very unique moment because a lot of these big companies in the last year have laid off all of these people, their in-house creative talent, but they still want to and need to make podcasts. They need stories, but they no longer have people on staff bringing them to them.
Agreed.
So it is, for a grassroots person, for an independent podcaster, it is actually a really good time to try to get yourself in front of one of these big companies with a story and say, I know you're looking for content. I've got it. Take me up on it. So I would say, yeah, keep creating because, when I first started out in podcasting, I didn't know what I was doing. And now, 10 years later, I, just signed a deal with one of the biggest podcast publishers in the world. I definitely wasn't at that level when I started, but I worked my way there because I loved the medium and I wanted to keep doing it. And so I would encourage anybody that feels passionately about audio storytelling to stick with it. There's going to be ups and downs, but you can do it. So yeah, and get a good mic.
Absolutely. I 150% agree with the mic. Absolutely. So again, TJ Raphael, audio journalist, reporter, producer, and host. Before we go to wrap things up, I want to go ahead and direct people to your website. Because while you're getting ready to get things started with the Wondery podcast, that's going to be upcoming, which we will be with bated breath waiting to go ahead and hear somewhere down the line, early 2025. You do have your website, tjraphael.com, TJRAPHAEL. Think of Sally Jesse Raphael. You know that name. There you go. The red glass
turtle.
Missing. So yeah, TJ Raphael, by the way, no relation. TJRaphael.com. You have the work when it comes to enterprise investigative reporting, on-air hosting of voiceovers, series development, show running, script writing and editing, producing, and tape sync, so much more. So for people that want to go ahead and reach out to you, let them know what they should go ahead and do if they're going to come to your website and possibly go work with you.
Yeah, feel free to send me a message through my website. You can also reach me on LinkedIn or Twitter. And yeah, I make my own stories, but I am available as a journalist for hire. So, if you want to create something together, if you have a tip that you need help sussing out, you need somebody to kick the tires on it, I am definitely down to collaborate. So you can reach me through my website and also see my recent work. And yeah, if you follow me on social media, you'll see when my new shows come up. So yeah, thank you so much, Jorge, for having me. This has been really fun. I love talking shop. And yeah, it's been great to be here.
Oh, thank you so much. The pleasure's been all mine. And seriously, the connection to LinkedIn, that's how we met. And I'm like, I was still surprised. Out of a whim, I just saw you there and I was like, let's just see what happens. And I'm so happy that you decided to come on and do this show. Thank you so much for being on. This was really great. And continued best success for you and yours.
Thanks. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you, folks. And once again, there we go, tjraphael.com. Make sure to go ahead and look at all the work that she's doing and also keep an eye on that podcast coming up through Wondery. And for all you listeners, thanks for listening again. As always, kingofpodcasts.com is where you find all my content. And we'll talk to you next time.